Hello, in this video we're going to discuss how God survived and made discoveries part 2. Now, as we already mentioned, God found a way to move around in the zero gravity using his hands, which emitted gravity from a fragment of gravity element that's inside God's skull. When God was inside the chamber, he returned there after his first time outside and touched the wall and made himself even more happy, as I described, which emits more gravity, which produced a wormhole exit point that emitted debris. This included ice and rock. Being hungry, God reached out and grabbed everything and tried to see if there was anything he could eat. He found that ice was good. It would melt in his mouth. Firstly, when God got back into the chamber, he refilled it with air. In order to do this, he had to turn off the wormhole that allowed him to go outside. So he turned off the wormhole that allowed him to go outside. Then he touched the other ball, the wall, to produce air. And then he had to refill his soul with a new body. So that process every time he came back. While inside the chamber with a new body, God then played with the wall and experimented using more gravity. And this emitted, as I mentioned, rock, ice, and there was something else in there that's important. Mana. So he tried eating the rock. It didn't work. He tried eating the ice. That helped quench his thirst. And then he found a biscuit floating in there, and that is called mana. So God consumed the mana. Mana is important. It is food for the soul. So without mana, what happens to the soul is it decays over time. Evidence of this is Satan. Satan was 3 foot tall in heaven before he was tossed out. Nowadays here on earth he's under 2 feet tall. So that's what happens if you're starved of mana and food and water. In soul form you shrink. So that was 400 billion years ago, and we can see and observe a decay in soul material. If this goes on more, then Satan would cease to exist after 1 trillion or so years. So God had to exist longer than 1 trillion years, and so with mana and ice, God was able to accomplish this. So whenever he returned to the chamber to have a rest from being at the work site, as we'll put it later, we'll start talking about the work site where God started to create stuff. He would always return to the chamber and refill his body. Of course, he'd have to put air in there first, refill his body, and then make ice and mana and munch on those. And that's how he survived. Of course, he'd always die of the cold, of asphyxiation mostly. God also discovered uranium, and this appeared warm, and it also appeared to produce light so God could see. But there's a problem here. It is radioactive. It made him sick, and so he kept that stuff out of his chamber. So in this environment, God would survive on ice and mana for trillions of years. That's all he could eat. And it was always in ice form until later he discovered that he could melt the ice and have water bubbles floating around in zero gravity. So moving outside, God experimented with the wormhole element. It's a very, very big asteroid that God is on that is consists entirely of wormhole element. And so if we remember the video about how to cut using wormholes, God made himself a staff of wormhole element by using the wormholes. He'd produce two. One would be the entry point, the other would be the exit point. By merely moving the wormhole entry point into the asteroid that he was on, he was able to slice away some wormhole element which came out the wormhole exit point. In order to accomplish this, what God did was went outside and he touched the side of the asteroid, and that produced one black ball. Then he used his other hand, that produced a second black ball, and then he found that he could slide his hands, and other influences produced movement of the black balls. And that's how he was able to cut wormhole element and make these rods. So he made wormhole element into rods and staffs. And then whenever God left that area, he'd always take some with him. What God discovered was by using the staff, he was able to better control the black ball, which is the wormhole. And so one day God made a massive wormhole, black ball, and then made a second one and put them together, and they vanished. And he didn't know where they went. They just vanished completely. Later on, God had discovered he could emit gravity element from a wormhole, and because of the size of the wormhole dictated the size of what was coming out. And he was using a large black ball wormhole which emitted gravity element that was the size of cars, that at one point because of their polarity chased him, and the collision with God and the staff produced a wormhole into another dimension. And suddenly God found himself in another dimension that wasn't his work site, as we'll put it. He found himself with debris that was in the area where those two black balls that had been combined were. So that's how God found himself in another dimension. Now God created a work light before this in order for him to see what it was that he was doing. The work light was a combination of two elements. It emitted light but no heat. It is still going to this day and does not need to be refueled or anything. So while God was working under light, all of a sudden he found himself in darkness, and he was trapped in this dimension with the wormhole element rod and gravity element that had chased him in there. While in there was where God discovered atmosphere. So while he was in there, at one point he emitted a black ball which emitted air, and when it did, he was floating around and found himself being pulled by the gravity element, and then went through the atmosphere and was pulled towards the gravity element, and found that he could hear himself complaining and swearing. And he described it as being the talking field. So now we see that gravity element could produce atmosphere and gravity. God eventually found a way to get out of that dimension by creating another wormhole that went back to his work site. I am the Archangel Daniel, and I'm from heaven.